Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Now, the Bible has a huge cast of characters. Some are well known and some have gotten a lot of scholarly and popular attention, but others seem to be ignored. Maybe they're just supporting characters in the larger stories of the main characters. Today we're going to try and explore some of these more minor characters and see what we can say about them. I think we'll find that there's actually a fair amount that we can say when we do a close reading of the text. But we'll also find that there's a lot more we can know when we supplement that reading with archaeology and a few educated guesses. With all that information, some of these minor characters can really come into focus. Today, we're going to look at Uriah the Hittite. Now, our man Uriah is most famous as the husband of Bathsheba and murder victim of King David. But let's go over the passages where Uriah appears, and then we can start to read between the lines a bit and flesh him out. Uriah features most prominently in the story of David and Bathsheba. That story is nestled in between accounts of one of David's wars with the Ammonites. In 2 Samuel 10, we see that David sends an envoy to the new Ammonite king. He says, "I will show kindness to Hanun son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me." But even though David wants to show kindness, his relationship with Hanun does not go well. One thing leads to another, and Israel ends up at war with the Ammonites and their Aramean or Syrian allies. 2 Samuel 11 begins with the infamous line about David remaining in Jerusalem while his army goes out to finish off the Ammonites. David then sees Bathsheba bathing and inquires about her. He's informed that she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. We know how this story goes. David sends for Bathsheba, Bathsheba becomes pregnant, and David sends for Uriah in an attempt to cover up his sin. David inquires about how the war is going and tells Uriah to go home and wash his feet. Now, every commentator recognizes this as an innuendo. Feet is a common euphemism for the male anatomy in the Hebrew Bible. And with that context, the phrase wash your feet is pretty clear. David isn't talking about literal feet. Uriah doesn't obey, though, and instead he sleeps at the palace with other members of the king's household. David's plan is frustrated, and when he asks Uriah why he disobeyed, Uriah says, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How can I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." But David isn't done trying to cover up what he's done. David tries to get Uriah drunk and then send him home to his wife, but that fails. So David reasons, if you can't join him, beat him. He sends Uriah back to the battlefront with a letter to Joab, the chief military commander, instructing him to put Uriah in a place where the fighting is fiercest and withdraw so that Uriah will be killed. Joab complies, and Uriah dies. So that's that, right? With Uriah out of the way, David takes Bathsheba as his wife. Not so fast, my friend. The court prophet Nathan confronts David with a hypothetical story that's eerily similar to David's own situation, and David is convicted of his sin, both adultery and murder. There is divine judgment, and the story ends with David besieging the city of Rabat Ammon and subjugating the Ammonites.
So this story is probably where you know the name Uriah from in the Bible, but it's not the only biblical reference to Uriah. He also appears in the list of David's so-called mighty men. These were the officers of David's army and his professional corps of soldiers. Some of them joined David when he was on the run from Saul, and without getting into all the nitty-gritty of what the titles and roles of these men are, we'll just say that we have two lists of David's military commanders. The earlier one in 2 Samuel 23 and the later one in 1 Chronicles 11. Chronicles was written after the exile, while Samuel clearly has pre-exilic material and is generally considered the earlier witness to the events of the monarchic period. And Uriah the Hittite appears in both lists. Now, let's unpack these sources for a minute, and we'll see how two different proposed backgrounds of Uriah have emerged. Both texts where Uriah appears have some issues. For example, a number of scholars have suggested that Uriah seems to be tacked on to the list of mighty men in 2 Samuel 23, as if there was a list, and then at a later point, his name was just added to the end. The First Chronicles list is likely relying on Samuel or the source material Samuel is relying on, so that won't really clarify much on this point. But the idea is that David and Bathsheba's story took on such an important rhetorical role that making Uriah one of David's mighty men only heightens the betrayal, so his presence in the list serves a rhetorical point more than a historical one. Another point that is made about David and Bathsheba's story is that it seems to be out of order chronologically within the larger Davidic narrative. The story is placed within the wider story of David's war against the Ammonites that begins when David wants to send an envoy to Hanun, son of Nahash, because Nahash had previously shown David kindness. There is a place where Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, shows kindness to David, but it is at the end of Absalom's revolt, which happens a few chapters later in 2 Samuel 17. There, Nahash sends his son to provide supplies to David and his men. Many scholars suggest that this kindness during Absalom's revolt is the kindness that David refers to in 2 Samuel 10, when the son of Nahash becomes king of the Ammonites. This would then shift the entire timeline of the war against the Ammonites, in which the David and Bathsheba story is embedded, to chronologically after Absalom's revolt. So the story of David and Bathsheba seems like it's been moved around a bit and is being used again to make a rhetorical point and provide justification for why the end of David's reign was marked by rebellion and episodes of disorder. He was being judged for his adultery and murder. Many scholars have also noted that the Bathsheba, David, Uriah triangle has parallels in 1 Samuel 25 with David, Abigail, and Nabal triangle. Both stories end up with David married to another man's wife after the original husband meets an untimely end. But David is only harshly judged for the Bathsheba and Uriah episode.
Okay, so what can we say about Uriah if all the texts where he appears have some complications? Well, a fair bit, actually. Uriah is a Hebrew name that means the Lord or Yahweh is my light. He is called the Hittite. Now, we have a video that discusses who the Hittites were in the Iron Age, and it's not the Bronze Age peoples who lived in modern-day Turkey. Instead, Hittites in the Iron Age were people who lived in Syria, people from what scholars call the Neo-Hittite states, which were an ethnically mixed patchwork of kingdoms. We also see that Uriah is married to Bathsheba, who is called the daughter of Eliam. Now, this inclusion is interesting because Eliam is also mentioned in 2 Kings 23 as one of David's mighty men. Eliam, son of Ahitophel, the Gilonite. Ahitophel was one of David's chief advisors, but this Ahitophel also sided with Absalom during Absalom's rebellion. Now, we don't know if Bathsheba's father Eliam is the same Eliam who was the son of Ahitophel, but if it is, then Bathsheba was the daughter of one of David's mighty men, possibly married to another one, and also the granddaughter of David's chief advisor. Now, it's notable that in Chronicles, Bathsheba is named Bathshua and is said to be the daughter of Amiel. There are some scholars who think Bathsheba had no relationship with Ahitophel, while others think that she is the daughter of Eliam, the same Eliam who was one of David's mighty men. Now, I'm inclined to be in the second group and would think Bathsheba and Uriah were a bit of a power couple in 10th century Jerusalem, who were closely connected with the Davidic court. Now, this all fits with what we understand about 10th century Jerusalem archaeologically. Even though it was David's capital city, it was a pretty small settlement. In our day and age, when we think of capital cities, we tend to think of modern nation states with a large bureaucratic apparatus that needs a large supporting population. So, capitals are often the largest cities in a country. But we don't need to think of 10th century Jerusalem like that. It was the capital because that's where the king and his court were. Jerusalem was a significant city in the sense that that's where the royal household and court were located, but it had not yet developed into an expansive urban area. The people living in 10th century Jerusalem would have included a possibly small Jebusite population who lived there prior to David taking control of the city, plus those who were directly associated with the Davidic court. Now, this leads to kind of a bifurcation in how we understand Uriah. Was he already within David's orbit and came to Jerusalem with the ascendant Judahite king, or was he from Jerusalem as part of the Jebusite population? Both are possible, and it kind of depends which texts you prioritize in importance as to which way you lean. Let's look at these possibilities. The first way to understand Uriah is to think of his life as a kind of rags to riches story. And we've discussed elsewhere in our channel about how David fits with what's called the Apiru cycle. You can check that out right here. Now, really quickly, the idea is that in the ancient world, there are times when people would be supplanted from their social environment and forced to go out to the world where they would live on the margins of society. They were often a dangerous or rough group of people who would congregate around a charismatic leader before ultimately settling back into ordered society, though often not back into their original context. The Semitic word for these kinds of people is apiru. Now, this is the pattern we see with David when he flees from Saul. In the cave of Adullam, a group of rough mercenary types congregate around David. Now, this seems to be the core of David's mighty men, which may have included Uriah. Now, this may explain why he is called the Hittite. He may have been a Syrian, ethnically Aramean or Hurrian, who had fled his homeland but joined David and his mighty men. He sticks with David, and by virtue of both his personal loyalty to David and feats of valor, he's given a high-ranking position after David is made king over Israel and settles in Jerusalem. Now that still leaves the question. If Uriah was not ethnically Israelite, why does he have a Hebrew name? Well, traditional Jewish scholars have suggested that Uriah was Israelite, and he lived among the Hittites for a while, and so he was called the Hittite, even though he was not actually a Hittite. Or perhaps more likely, he was an Aramean who converted and perhaps took a Hebrew name. But whatever his ethnic background, it's apparent that he knows Israelite law. He abstains from relations with his wife, or women more generally, as this seems to be the proscribed behavior when the Israelite army was at war. So, one version of Uriah's story is that he may be a foreigner from Syria who was displaced from his homeland and joined David's forces, where he's afforded a high rank and position in the Israelite court. He's given a new name that honors the God of Israel and is married into an important and influential family. He knows Israelite law, and he zealously abides by it despite being a foreigner. Now, this story seems to fit with how frequently throughout the Hebrew Bible God expresses his concern over the treatment of the downtrodden, including foreigners. This rags to riches story is very plausible with a somewhat straightforward reading of the text. Uriah was originally a foreigner, but he had assimilated into Israelite society by taking on a Yahwistic theophoric name and following their religious laws. He married into one of the elite families in the early monarchic period, perhaps as a recognition of his loyalty and devotion to David, but he was ultimately murdered by Israel's king, despite following the God of Israel. Now, this reading works particularly well if you think the inclusion of Uriah in 2 Samuel 23 is original and not a later insertion. This interpretation wouldn't work particularly well if you think the David and Bathsheba story is out of order chronologically and actually came after Absalom's rebellion. Assuming Bathsheba was the granddaughter of Ahithophel, it makes sense that he may side against David and with Absalom when Absalom rebels, if he holds a grudge against the old king for how he treated his family. But that makes less sense if the Bathsheba story comes after Absalom's rebellion. But with all that said, there is another way of looking at Uriah.
The alternative reading is more of a riches to rags story. In this version of the story, Uriah is not a foreigner from Syria who joins David during his early days running from Saul. Instead, Uriah may be a Jebusite elite, possibly even from the Jebusite royal family. That means rather than earning his position, he sticks around in Jerusalem after David takes it over and the ruling Jebusites are deposed. Okay, so where is this coming from? Scholars look all the way to Ezekiel 16, where the prophet, speaking of Jerusalem, says, "Your ancestry and birth were in the land of the Canaanites, your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite." Samuel calls the inhabitants of Jerusalem prior to David's conquest of the city Jebusite. While there is debate as to who exactly the Jebusites were, some look to this Ezekiel passage and suggest that the Jebusites had a Syrian heritage, specifically Hurrian, what Ezekiel calls Hittite. In the Amarna letters from the 14th century, one of the kings of Jerusalem is named Abdi-Heba, which is a name meaning servant of Habat. Habat is a known Hurrian goddess, so this is often cited as a clear reference to Hurrian influence in the city. Even in 2 Samuel 24, David purchases a threshing floor in Jerusalem from the Jebusite identified as Araunah. Scholars are largely in agreement that Araunah is of Hurrian origin and is not a name, but a title or honorific meaning the Lord, pointing to him being among the Jebusite elite that remained in Jerusalem after David took the city. Some have even suggested that he may have been the king prior to David taking Jerusalem. In fact, because Araunah is not a name, some scholars have suggested possible identifications for who he was. The most frequently cited is Zadok, the guy who shows up once David takes Jerusalem and serves in the role of priest, but at least one scholar has suggested that Uriah may have been, if not the king, then part of the royal Jebusite family. Personally, I don't think the argument for Uriah being the former Jebusite king is particularly strong, but it's an interesting suggestion. However, a Jebusite background for Uriah is quite commonly suggested, and it fits with the so-called Jebusite hypothesis, which argues that several prominent figures in David's court were not Judahite, but Jebusite. Some of these proposed Jebusite figures include the aforementioned Zadok, but also Nathan the prophet, as well as Uriah and Bathsheba. But what about Uriah's Hebrew name? Yah is my light. Proponents of the Jebusite hypothesis have suggested that the name Uriah is the Hebrew translation of a Hurrian name Ariah, meaning ruler or even king. It's also been suggested that his name originally was the Hurrian which had a Hurrian theophoric element that got changed to Yah to make Uriah, which is a more acceptable name befitting his position to the Davidic court. But these etymologies would suggest that Uriah was someone of significance within the Jebusite aristocracy, and his proximity to the court of David was not so much out of loyalty to David, but as a kind of olive branch between David and his newly conquered city. David was incorporating the existing aristocracy into his new court, maybe in the sense of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. This may also cast the behavior of Uriah and Bathsheba in a different light. Uriah may have known what was going on when he was recalled from the war and refused to go along with David's attempted cover-up. He slept at the palace entrance and likely heard the gossip, so he pretends to be a devout Israelite when he is in fact forcing David and Bathsheba to recognize the true paternity of their child. Maybe he was not devoutly following Israelite law, but shrewdly using it as a means to an end of embarrassing the usurper king. Again, which Uriah you see is open to interpretation. Both versions of Uriah's origin can be reasonably interpreted using the biblical text. It just depends which texts you think are more or less significant in regards to Uriah's background. How we see Uriah doesn't just factor into understanding Uriah, but it can also influence how we see Bathsheba.
Now, before we get into this, let me be clear that David is the one who bears the blame for the entirety of this episode. Bathsheba is never blamed for her behavior, and the power differential between her and David is certainly an important dynamic in this story. However, several scholars have noted that Bathsheba is depicted elsewhere in the text as very politically adept. In 1 Kings, she gets Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, both possibly Jebusites, remember, to go along with her scheme to get her son Solomon named as David's successor instead of David's other son and presumed heir. In fact, the name Solomon means his replacement. Some scholars have suggested that we should not view Bathsheba as merely a silent and passive figure in 2 Samuel 11. We should instead read between the lines a bit and see her as having a degree of agency. For example, some have contrasted her behavior with that of Judith, who resisted overtures from more powerful male figures while they saw her bathing. We can instead see Bathsheba as offering herself to David in a sense as the newly recognized king and ascendant power broker in the city. Multiple scholars, again noting her apparent familiarity and proximity with the royal court, suggest that she may have bathed in view of the king intentionally. Her bathing in view of the palace could be seen as a kind of seduction which David falls for. She may have read the tea leaves and thought it would be better to be aligned with David rather than with the old Jebusite aristocracy. Her marriage to Uriah was likely arranged, and she may have held no great affection for him. She may have exercised her own agency to look after her own interests in what was certainly a period of significant social upheaval in Jerusalem. And once she found herself within David's royal family, she maneuvered to ensure her offspring would be the heir to David's throne. Now again, this is not to say that Bathsheba was asking for it or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to say or imply whatsoever. David is clearly the one at fault throughout this episode, but he may not be the only one with agency. The whole point of this story is that David sins and suffers mightily because of it. You cannot shift blame away from David for this. But it's also important to note that this is a story that is set in context thousands of years removed from our own time. And when we read it with the characters involved, David, Uriah, and Bathsheba, in their 10th century Iron Age context, we can see the whole episode in a different way. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. If you want to learn more, be sure to check out our video on the biblical Hittites and this one on the Apiru or Habiru in the ancient Near East. Finally, we would love for you to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.